Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Bonsard of Radio Retro Future, and welcome to another Rambling Writer's Diaries. It has been a while since I did one of these, but today, based on some recent experiences during my writing adventures, I came across some subjects that I think it's worth talking about, which is research and fiction. Like, how much research do you have to do before starting on your story? First of all, I need to start with that I am a historian, so you can imagine that I already have a bit of I have a keen interest in history. That's the point I want to make here. I often use historical situations as examples for my stories. And that gives me a lot of things to write about. Like I said, whenever I come across something that is of interest to me, often historical situations, I make notes and I kind of write a quick concept of how I could possibly turn this into a story, and sometimes I'll continue that story only like a month down the road. Recently, I finished another story which also has characters based on historical figures. I'll put a link down in the description. I'm rather proud of it, actually. And what I come across is I'm a stickler for facts, right? For example, I was writing a scene for a book, and it was about storks. I wanted to have like a rundown factory, and rundown factories, or at least in the Netherlands, often have stork nests because they like high up places, and storks in general like ruins because they can make like these big nests on top of them. I think one of the way to attract mates is like to build a big as nest as possible. So old factory chimneys are ideal for them. And so I thought, yes, I'm gonna make a scene with a stork nest, and I want to do a little bit more of that, narratively speaking. So I started to do a little bit of like research. I wasn't even sure what I wanted to know about white storks, but what I did find out was that the stork. But what I found out is that the stork hasn't appeared since recently. It has made a comeback in England together with another bird I was thinking about including, the pelicans. They too have been gone from England for about 600 years, and only in the recent like 10 years or so, not even that, I think, they made a comeback. In other words, my story, which is about 1870, no storks. Now, I could explain this away by saying, oh well, alternate universe, who cares? But then again, it was like 600 years they were absent. So, and my timeline does not really diverge since like 1790 or something like that. So it still makes no sense. And one of the reasons, one of the big things for England, what a major problem was massive deforestation. So that's probably why the stork disappeared in the first place. So that's an important detail, right? Now, one person would say, "Oh, it's a bird. Who cares?" And it's not so much that the reader doesn't know. I know. But I am not gonna give myself that leniency, because for me those details are important. Showing, for me a story comes from the passion of the writer, and you can tell when filmmakers or writers are passionate about the subjects that they care about, and including such details, or in this particular case leave out so no one will notice, is for me what makes or breaks stories. To name an exception, and I know a lot of people love this film who will watch my channel, they'll probably love this film, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Now, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen with Sean Connery, it has nothing to do with the comic, first of all. Like, it takes some things from the comic, and they do have some of the villains and that type of stuff. There are similarities, but really that's where it ends. That is not even what I want to talk about. Now, what I wanted to talk about was that in the film The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, they use the Mark I or Mark VI tank. The famous, iconic British tank from World War I with the weapon sponsors on the sides. And the tracks running across the whole length of the vehicle. Another thing they did was they showed English soldiers in that same scene and they wore Tommy helmets. Why do I bring that up? Well, one of the reasons is because those Tommy helmets were introduced, I think, in 1917, relatively late in the First World War. I thought it was 1917 because of head wounds, and they nearly abolished those helmets too, because when the helmets got introduced, and the British general saw that the number of head wounds increased. They almost wanted to say, oh, no, we gotta abolish these helmets. I mean, for some reason, or soldiers are doing stupid things, and now they're getting all these head wounds. Now then, somebody who actually knows how statistics works, went to the general and said, no, wait, you're reading this wrong. Those head wounds would, in the past, have been fatalities. That the helmets are saving the soldiers who are wounded in the head. So it's like, okay. But yeah, that is 1917. The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen is taking place in 1891, I think. In other words, those helmets were not even invented. The situation in which those helmets were introduced did not happen. This is a very famous story among, any World War I geeks. So they immediately picked that up. The same goes for the Mark I tank. And you just say, well, it's not exactly a Mark I tank. They clearly took some liberties. But here's the thing. People often tend to believe that early design vehicles are designed like, oh, they didn't know what a tank looked like, so they were just doing something. They did not think about the design or anything. They were just, improvising, as it were. No, they really, really, really thought a long time about the Mark I tank. Now, of course, they didn't think of the rotating cupola that the French Renault F-17 did. That one actually became the future. And again, that plays a role into the tank design of the Mark I. The Mark I was especially designed for that particular war. The idea is that they were long enough to cross trenches. Again, no one expected the First World War to last the length that it did. Everyone assumed it was going to be a mobile war, very much like the Franco-Prussian War that happened 40 years before. And there were some other wars. And the trenches were used. Of course, there were plenty of trenches used. But they were like actual fortifications. They were like either defending particular important positions one army approached and then, tried to take it by force. They were not meant to last for years in stalemate. So these were often pre-prepared fortifications, and then the battle lasted maybe a few weeks at most. I don't even recall battles taking that long that weren't about taking actual forts. So that's what the circumstances of the Mark I was. Now, of course, then the Mark I tank and the Renault F-17 was introduced. The Germans attempted their own tank that was by no means as successful. Also, by that time, Germany didn't have the resources to build the amount of tanks that the British were building. But yeah, they made trenches obsolete. So if those tanks were introduced at the beginning of the First World War right away, then we would have had a completely different war. But also that design of the Mark I would have been obsolete from the very get-go. They would probably have gone for something like the Renault F-17 right away. And that's what they started to develop very quickly afterwards. Like they built some box-like tanks with multiple turrets and side sponsors. But yeah, they quickly realized that those things did not work. That mobility was far more efficient. And then you, of course, had the Blitzkrieg of the 1940s, which proved medium tanks like the T-34 and the Panzer IV and the Sherman far more effective, especially for long-term conflicts, than, let's say, the super tanks like the Tiger, which also has a great amount of problems. Yes, it was a successful tank in the field. Problem was, it was also very expensive tanks. And we don't really know the numbers of how effective Tiger tanks were. So, as you can see, based on this alone, there is a lot that goes into knowing something about tanks. And once you know that stuff, right, and you see things in films or books appear, you're like, this does not make sense. And if a writer, right, knew anything about basic tanks, they must have realized this does not make sense. And you look at a scene like the one I talked about in League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and you're like, wait, someone must have known better. Someone must have said, can we not use a different tank design? But their logic was, of course, oh, well, everyone knows the Mark I tank, so that's what we're gonna do. This is Hackery 101, as far as I'm concerned. They could have gone, like, when you look at, for example, again, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen comic, Alan Moore, that creator, I mean, there are a lot of historical references in there. Too many to name. From the clothes to the fashion to a lot of the things. Or a fashion historian could probably say, oh no, they did not have that type of ribbon or something like that in that time. But you can clearly see that, the fantastical is like truly fantastical, whereas, the historical elements look historical. It feels historical. And so you have this clear separation between the history on which it is based and the over-the-top sci-fi tropes that it uses. Another example of this that does this very well is Steamboy, which also has like these very idyllic Victorian factory buildings and houses and city. It actually is like, okay, this is a Victorian city, or London in this particular case. It actually feels and looks like London. Whereas you've got like the fantasy tropes. Oh man, they go all out with the fantasy tropes, like motorcycles and giant claws and airships and all that stuff, like power armor based on medieval knights. They cared a lot about the aesthetics that they used. Unlike League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, who basically said, oh, we're just going to copy some World War I stuff and pretend it all makes sense. That's, for me, the difference. Now, you can argue, like, how far do you go? Like, for example, what I discovered about the White Stork. It's like a detail, say, few readers, like maybe bird enthusiasts, would pick up that the White Stork was not present in that year in England, or at least if it were like extremely rare, if any at all. So maybe that's a small detail that few people cared about. I finally choose the Grey Heron, or as we call it, the Reiger. I think it's called a Heron in English. And that's not so much, because I think, oh, this is the most important thing ever. No, this is more that I know it's wrong. So every time I'll read that story in the future, I know that's something that did not happen. Right? And I recently proofread a story for somebody who's making something for the Association of Ishtar, on which I am giving weekly workshops now. Every, Monday morning, 8 p.m. UTC, and Thursday evening, 7 p.m. UTC. If you want to join us and learn to write, it's a really basic workshop. Maybe I'm gonna do more advanced classes at some point, but my current audience is like writers getting their feet wet. So yeah, if you want to join those workshops, please join us on the Discord. They are free, for now, at least. Where was I? Oh yes, I was proofreading a story for one of the participants, and he came up with this concept, and there were a lot of things to remark, and one of them was like the use of resources in the world. And the idea was that the use of fossil fuels is illegal. Okay, that's a big task, very big task. How do you go about it? Well, as I would go about it is first answer the question like why are they illegal? Like are there eco-fascists in the world or something? That would be one of the first questions I would wanna tackle. Then the second one would be okay, what would the world be like? Because fossil fuels that includes coal, and I'm like okay, how do you forge iron without coal? If you cannot burn coal, what do you burn? Because you need heat. You need a lot of heat. So where does that come from? I mean, cars is easy because they had electric cars already all the way up to, well, basically the invention of the Ford T. So electric cars were very in sway. You can find actual pictures of like charging stations for cars. It sounds like, oh, that sounds a bit futuristic, but no, they were very common. For the people who could afford it, at least. But yeah, then the 4T, the affordable petroleum-based car was introduced, and electric cars disappeared. Not overnight, but they could not compete because of the limited range. You just have a lot more possibilities with fueled cars. But if you take away things like petroleum or coal, like okay, how are metal objects made? If you cannot, because the alternative is like wood coal, which is also interesting because they did use that for a very long time. However, they also deforested like entire parts of Europe because of that. So people did not care much about forest preservation apart from hunters. If there was a forest around the 1800s, it was probably the property of some lord who used it as hunting grounds. And everything else was basically gone. Like the wood used for the famous English longbow came from Portugal. Now, apparently, I think from the top of my head, that wood is also better for making English style longbow. So there's that. But yeah, they needed to import all that. And we're talking about 1400s, 1400s here. I think they used the English longbow up to about 1600. Very long time. Well into the age of gunpowder. So, knowing all that, it is... my brain starts working, and when I read somebody's work who has not taken all those, well, historical details, and it's hard to call them details because they were structural issues, things that were major problems during those periods for anyone involved in those industries. You're like, huh, I know this cannot be the case. And you have to read this story, and this is where the whole suspension of disbelief comes in. Like when I use a stork instead of a gray heron, most readers, A, like I said, don't know, and two, they're like, who cares, right? It's a bird. Like it's the development of the world is not gonna depend on a stork or a heron being at that particular location. But when you read like somebody who says that, let's say somebody in 1850s Britain, let's say in London, never heard of a car before. It's like saying, well, we never, telling somebody no one has heard of a horse and carriage before, right? So you have to be. So that's the thing, and you can say, oh, if people don't know, what's the harm? But that's the thing. We live in an age of the internet. If I want to know something about the white stork, all I need to do is go to Google or DuckDuckGo, type in, history, white stork, living habitat, something like that. And then all of a sudden, instead of a Wikipedia article, I see a news article that says the white stork has returned, and then you read the article and says, oh well, the white stork has returned after an absence of 600 years. You're like, oh. The same goes for World War One. Anyone, let's say you're writing a book that's inspired by the history of World War One, but you don't investigate anything about World War One. You only use the common tropes of that war. However, the people who will read your book are probably like, oh, look, a World War One. I love the First World War. Then maybe it will have like these and these characters, you know. And then they read your book, and then you, let's say, all of a sudden you're describing how, like in 1914, like Mark I tanks are riding across the landscape, and they're like, yeah, that's not gonna fly for people like that. So let's say that you're writing a romance, and like one of the backgrounds of the characters is that he's a World War One veteran. Like, the war itself does not play a major role, but because it's a romance story that takes place in England, but you know, it's a bit of you know, he has seances because he lost his brother in the war, for example. You know, seances were very popular in the wake of, well, about every war. I think it also had a revival in the wake of the Crimean War, for example. I think I read something like that. I'm not sure, but you know, those things did happen. And now, for most people who are interested in Victorian romance, are like, oh, you know, seances and oh, mystery, blah blah blah. And then you describe like a little scene, let's say the death scene of the brother in 1915, and you know, then all of a sudden you say, well, there were like 16 Mark I tanks driving by. None of those the readers are gonna care. Why? They care about the romance story. They're not gonna care about, you know, you including the wrong vehicle in the wrong year, right? But if you go try to sell that book to World War One enthusiasts, and you describe, let's say the Tommy helmet that was worn in 1914, they're like, you know, no, they didn't have that helmet in 1914. They had that in 1917. You know, and that's the difference, I think. So it's not so much about getting things wrong or not including various details. It's about knowing your audience. Very long-winded way to get there. Consider this like a reaction from somebody who does care about, you know, historical details and economics and policies, right? Ooh, policies. That's a great minefield because no one's gonna agree on that. But I think my rant has lasted long enough. I think what I have not talked about is, like, I do my research as I write, like, for example, with the White Stork situation. I was including it in a scene, and I was like, well, let's do a little bit of research. Like Google, or, you know, DuckDuckGo, whatever you use. You know, there is little excuse these days for a writer to say, oh, I did not know that. If you didn't know something, it will usually mean, no, you're right, I didn't bother to research this subject whatsoever. Folks, when you go to YouTube, there are so many documentary channels. There is so much on services like Audible these days. You know, you don't even have to pay that much attention. You can just listen while doing the dishes or your whatever work around the house. So really, you know, invest in an Audible account or whatever online courses there are. The Courses Plus has a lot of things on history and technology as well. Now, listen to some TED Talks. There is so much information out there, and all you need to do is click the link and you listen while you're doing other stuff. So really, there's little excuse in that regard. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I think I rambled on long enough. This was Bonsard of Radio Retro Future, and as always, make things your way. Good night.